It's a strange thing, the tricks the mind plays when you're alone in the dark. But what do you do when the trick isn't in your mind, but is breathing softly from the corner of your room? The Sterling Hotel was a relic, a stubborn ghost of a bygone era standing defiant against the sleek, sand-steel modernity of the city's downtown. For Liam, it was simply the only option available on short notice for his one-night business trip. The air was thick with the scent of old wood, dust, and something else. Something faintly chemical, like old-fashioned cleaning fluid, trying and failing to mask decades of decay. He hadn't seen another guest since he checked in. It's the concierge, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with a weary sort of sadness. Who would be calling him at this hour? It had to be the front desk. Maybe they'd made a mistake with his room. Maybe they needed to move him. About to hang up, annoyed, when a voice emerged from the noise. It was a whisper, a dry, papery sound, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. He'd informed him that due to a series of last-minute cancellations, he was one of only 3 people staying the night. The online reviews had called it historic and charming, but as he walked the dimly lit, cavernous hallways, other words came to mind: empty, silent, and, if he was being truly honest with himself, creepy. Inside, it was spacious to a fault. It was a strange connection. The voice sounded both distant and incredibly close at the same time. Grand 4-poster bed dominated the space. Its dark mahogany frame seeming to absorb the weak light from the single bedside lamp he dared to turn on. The rest of the room was a geography of shadows. The heavy armchair sat brooding in one corner, and a tall, imposing wardrobe stood against the far wall, its mirrored door clouded with age. Liam felt a primal urge to open it, to prove to himself it was just an empty piece of furniture, but he resisted. Something was wrong. The voice wasn't just quiet. It was. He could still hear it. The dry, sibilant whisper was in the air around him. He slowly, deliberately placed the receiver back onto its cradle, cutting the connection. Faint, muffled, but it was there. His eyes darted wildly around the darkened room. The single lamp cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and twitch. The armchair in the corner was a hulking, dark mass. The wardrobe stood silent and imposing, intimate, muffled, like someone speaking with their hand cupped over the mouthpiece. He hadn't said a word to anyone. He hadn't even thought about room service. The strangeness of the call suddenly morphed into a very real, very sharp spike of fear. From the deep, impenetrable darkness that pooled around the old armchair, he wrenched the door open and stumbled out into the hallway, not bothering to grab his wallet, his phone, or even his clothes. He couldn't scream. He couldn't move. He could only lie there, eyes wide with stark terror, listening. His entire world had shrunk to the space between him and that shadowed corner. Silence he had found so oppressive before was now a longed-for sanctuary. He simply picked up a phone, his movements slow and deliberate, and spoke in a low voice. He didn't stop running until he burst through the main doors of the lobby, gasping for breath, and collapsed in front of the concierge's desk. He could feel a cold spot in the room, a tangible drop in temperature that seemed to emanate from that direction. Liam, shivering in just his boxers, could only stammer out 2 words. Room 313. It was the exact same voice, the same dry, scraping sound. It was no longer muffled by a phone line. He left the city that day and never returned. He tells people he had a panic attack, a nightmare brought on by stress in an old, creepy hotel. It's easier than explaining the truth. It's easier than admitting that sometimes, when he's alone in a quiet room, Kay can still hear the faint, dry whisper of a voice that knows things it shouldn't. A voice that promised him anything he wanted, and which, he is certain, is still waiting patiently in the dark corner of a room he will never forget. It was raw, present, and undeniably in the room with him. He started to pull the phone away from his ear, intending to slam it down, when he noticed something. He didn't want to know what was inside. It was a soft, conspiratorial whisper that slid through the darkness and wrapped itself around him. The carpets, a deep, blood-red floral pattern, seemed to swallow the sound of his rolling suitcase. Every creak of the old building, every groan of the ancient pipes, felt amplified, deliberate. Every beat of his frantic heart was a drum pounding out a rhythm of pure, unadulterated horror. With a choked sob, he threw the bedsheets aside and scrambled out of the opposite side of the bed, his bare feet hitting the cold floor with a slap. He didn't look back. He couldn't. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on the corner. He didn't see a figure. He didn't see movement, but he felt a presence. He felt it with an animal certainty that bypassed all logic. It was watching him, patient, amused. Around 11:30 p.m., he finally gave up, stripped down to his boxers, and slid between the cold, crisp sheets of the enormous bed. Sleep, he hoped, would be a merciful escape. His room, number 313, was at the far end of a long, narrow corridor. He tried to distract himself with work, but the oppressive silence of the hotel was a constant, ringing presence. Kay was hovering in that hazy space between wakefulness and slumber when the sound sliced through the quiet. Rearing. The shrill, old-fashioned bell of the bedside telephone jolted him fully awake. His heart hammered against his ribs. He fumbled for the receiver, his hand clumsy with sleep. The plastic felt slick and cold. "Hello," he mumbled, his voice thick. For a moment, there was only static, a faint, crackling hiss. "Did you need something, sir?" Liam frowned, confused. "What? Who is this? Room service?" The whispering voice was low, and he had to press the receiver hard against his ear to make it out. "You can order anything you like," the whisper continued, a strange, lilting cadence to the words. "We have ... everything." Kale, entirely separate from the cold of the room, snaked its way up Liam's spine. "I think you have the wrong room," Liam said, his patience wearing thin. "I didn't call for anything." There was a soft, wet sound from the other end to chuckle. It was a horrible, guttural noise that seemed to catch in the speaker's throat. "Oh, but you did," the voice whispered. "You've been thinking about it." Liam froze. The blood in his veins turned to ice. The sound, the whispering, it wasn't just coming from the earpiece. He held the receiver a few inches from his head, his breath catching in his chest. His gaze snapped back to the phone in his hand. The whispering didn't stop. It was coming from the corner of the room. Paralysis seized him. His body became a leaden weight, pinning him to the mattress. Then the voice spoke again, no longer a question about room service, but a statement of horrifying fact. "I know you're awake." Time ceased to exist. He doesn't remember making a conscious decision to move. It was pure, primal instinct that finally broke the spell. He lunged for the door, his hands shaking so violently it took him 3 tries to undo the latch and the deadbolt. He just ran. The long, red-carpeted hallway seemed to stretch on for miles. The old man looked up, his weary expression shifting to one of mild alarm, but not surprise. A flicker of something recognition, pity, maybe even fear passed through the concierge's eyes. He didn't ask what happened. Liam never went back to the room. The hotel staff retrieved his belongings the next morning, carrying them into his suitcase and leaving it for him at the front desk. Of all the things you might find left behind in a hotel room, a voice is by far the most dangerous, because a voice can follow you home. The hotel was a monument to mediocrity, one of 1,000 identical buildings flanking 1,000 identical highways. For David, it was just another stop, another lumpy mattress, another stale continental breakfast, another night spent staring at a ceiling that wasn't his own. David loosened his tie, his gaze drifting around the space. It was an older, clunkier model than he was used to seeing. a relic from the early 2000s with big, red, digital numbers. Below the display, small row of buttons included one labeled voice memo. A flicker of idle curiosity cut through his weariness. He'd had one like this in college. It's not constant. It stops and starts. It sounds closer. I called the front desk. The night manager said I'm the only guest on this floor tonight. He offered to move me, but there was one more memo. His hand trembled as he reached for the button. He had to know how it ended. He pressed play. I don't know. I felt stupid complaining about a noise. It's cold in here too. Thermostat says 72, but I can see my breath. The man let out a thin, reedy scream of absolute horror. There was a sickening, wet crunch, followed by a moment of what sounded like struggling. Then, the man's voice, impossibly loud, impossibly close to the recorder's microphone, shrieked a final, soul-shattering message. He scrambled off the bed, his breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The room, which minutes ago was simply bland, now felt like a tomb. Every shadow pulsed with malevolent energy. The silence was a living thing, pressing in on him, suffocating him. Tay, it feels like there's an open window, but everything is sealed shut. K, keep feeling like someone's watching me. K, his graying hair, his wrinkled shirt, the terror etched onto his features. It was him. It was just him. A prank. It had to be a prank. Some sick employee, some former guest with a twisted sense of humor. Every time I glance at the mirror on the wardrobe, I think I see something. A flicker. A shadow that's the wrong shape. He took another step. He was only a few feet away now, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. It was all normal. It was all him. Without thinking, he pressed the play button. David felt a chill crawl up his own spine, entirely unrelated to the room's temperature. He stood up and walked to the thermostat. 72 degrees. He had to see that it was just his own face, his own skin. He needed to break the spell. To the tall, dark, gleaming surface of the mirror. It stood there, impassive, reflecting the empty room, the rumpled bed, the open door of the bathroom. Yet, the air felt frigid, clinging to his skin like a damp shroud. He stared at the wardrobe, at the mirror. It was just a reflection. His reflection, pale, wide-eyed. He was letting a stupid recording get to him. It's not scratching anymore. It's in the room. I don't know how. Had the chair wedged under the handle. I heard the lock click. It didn't open the door. It just came through. Oh God, the shadow. It peeled itself off the wall. It's not a shadow. It's a thing, swearing. It's trying to wear the clothes from the wardrobe. Tay doesn't have a face. It's just a shape. A man-shaped hole in the air. The eyes in the mirror were his, but they were filled with an ancient, predatory hunger. As David watched, paralyzed in a grip of e-skull dread, the reflection raised its other hand and gave him a slow, friendly wave, its fingers stretching just a little too long. I'm in the bathroom. I have the door locked. It's scraping at the door now. It knows I'm in here. I saw its reflection. Not in the mirror, in the blank TV screen. It was standing behind me. It was smiling, but it doesn't have a mouth. It doesn't have a... He expected nothing. Maybe a corrupted file or a beep. Right. It was quiet. Too quiet. In most hotels, you could hear the hum of an ice machine or the muffled chatter from a neighboring room. A wet, tearing sound, like fabric being slowly ripped apart. It was followed by a choked sob. Here, there was only a profound, listening silence. He shook his head, chalking the unease up to road fatigue. He tossed his briefcase onto the luggage rack, the sigh escaping his lips, tasting of recycled air and exhaustion. It was someone's private recording. But the silence that followed the click of the recording ending was heavier than before. The man had mentioned the wardrobe. David's eyes darted to the corner, to the dark, polished wood and the mirror that reflected a distorted version of his own tired face. He saw nothing, heard nothing. It was just a story, a prank, maybe. He was about to turn it off when he noticed the display indicated a second memo. He hesitated for only a second before pressing play again. A 7 a.m. meeting in a city he'd never see outside of a conference room awaited him. And all he wanted was 6 hours of dreamless sleep. The room was standard issue. 2 queen beds with stiff beige comforters, a desk, and a heavy wardrobe with a full-length mirror embedded in its door. A faint scratching sound coming from the corner by the wardrobe. Probably just the pipes or something from next door. It's an old building. Still, it's rhythmic, annoying. Going to try and ignore it. His eyes landed on the bedside table, on the alarm clock. Instead, a man's voice filled the silent room. Memo 1, 11:43 p.m. Just a note for my own sanity, I guess. Can't sleep. There's a noise. The voice was calm, if a little tired. David felt a strange, voyeuristic pang. He should stop listening. Memo 2, 1:17 a.m. It's louder now, scratching. The man's voice had changed. The calm was gone, replaced by a strained, high wire tension. He sat back on the bed, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. The recording began not with a voice, but with a sound. Memo 3, 3:04 a.m. The man's voice was a ragged whisper, laced with pure, unadulterated terror. The whisper was cut off by a deafening crash, the sound of splintering wood. It's wearing my skin. Don't look in the mirror. Then, silence. Not the end of a recording, but an abrupt, chilling cut to nothing. David ripped his hand back from the clock as if it were red hot. Don't look in the mirror. The words echoed in his mind, a frantic, screaming mantra, but his eyes were drawn, as if by a physical force, to the wardrobe in him. He stood frozen, halfway across the room. He could see his reflection clearly. He took a slow, deliberate step closer. He had to prove it to himself. He raised a trembling hand, and in the mirror, his reflection did the same. He let out a shaky breath, a laugh, threatening to bubble up from his chest. It was all in his head. He was safe. And then his reflection smiled. It wasn't his smile. It was too wide, too sharp, stretching his lips in a way they were never meant to go. Of all the rooms and all the inns in the world, some are not meant for the living. They are not rooms at all. They are waiting tombs, and the key you hold is not for a door, but for the end of your story. Clara was exhausted, her knuckles white on the steering wheel when she saw it. Flickering neon sign that simply read, Inn. It was attached to a sprawling, 3-story colonial building that seemed to sag under the weight of its own history. The Blackwood Inn. It looked like the kind of place that had been watching the world change for centuries, unimpressed. For Clara, it was a port in the storm, nothing more. The rain had been relentless, a driving, silver sheet that turned the winding back roads of New England into a treacherous maze. A single, low-wattage lamp cast long, dancing shadows from the antique furniture. Behind a dark, polished oak counter stood a man, so pale and still he might have been one of the inn's fixtures. Her heart was starting to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. He wouldn't meet her gaze, instead busying himself with a leather-bound ledger that looked as old as the inn itself. People see what they want to see when they're tired. This wasn't right. Nothing about it was right. K. 4-poster bed, a heavy velvet curtain over the single large window, a mahogany writing desk, K, and on the wall opposite the bed, a collection of portraits. It was a trick of the light, a smudge on the metal that looked like her name. She paid in cash, took the key, and turned toward the grand, creaking staircase. The weight of the key in her hand feeling less like a promise of rest and more like a manacle. To the right of Eleanor Vance, there was a 6th frame. He retrieved a key, a real, old-fashioned key of tarnished brass, heavy and ornate. She stared at the last portrait, a severe-looking woman in a 1970s dress, her painted eyes looking not at the artist. Her eyes dropped to the brass plaque screwed into the wall beneath it. Her blood ran cold, and the air rushed from her lungs in a choked gasp. But it's something beyond the frame, something in the room with Clara. Below the portrait was a small brass plaque. It read, Eleanor Vance, October 12th, 1978. She fumbled with the lock, her hands shaking uncontrollably. It wouldn't turn. She threw her shoulder against the wood, again and again, but it was like trying to move a mountain. She pounded on the door until her fists were bruised and her voice was gone, collapsing into sobs. Defeated, she slid down to the floor, her back against the unyielding wood. Her eyes, blurred with tears, scanned the room one last time. It was sealed shut, the earlier click of the lock now sounding like the toll of a funeral bell. The air grew colder with each step, the silence so profound she could hear the blood pulsing in her ears. In each and every painting, the subject was holding a key. Not just any key, it was her key. The same ornate brass key she now clutched in her own sweating palm. Room 313 was at the very end, its door a slab of dark, imposing wood. Their painted eyes seemed to have changed. The neutrality was gone, replaced by a look of grim pity. They were no longer just paintings, they were witnesses. She shrieked, her voice raw with terror. Somebody, let me out, please. On the small writing desk in the corner, where there had been nothing before, now sat a single, pristine artist's brush, its bristles stark white. Next to it was a small porcelain pot, open and waiting, filled to the brim with the blackest paint she had ever seen. The room was no longer silent. From somewhere deep within the walls, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a clock, ticking steadily, counting down the final hours to sunrise. The key slid into the lock with a well-oiled click that echoed in the stillness. He slid it across the counter. Room 313, top of the stairs, end of the hall on the left. His eyes, the color of faded denim, held no welcome, only a weary sort of resignation. They were formal, serious portraits of 4 men and 1 woman, spanning what looked like a century of fashion. A man with a handlebar mustache from the 1890s, a woman with bobbed hair from the roaring 20s, a young man in a soldier's uniform from the 40s. Each face was different, each from a different time, but they all shared one impossible detail. A coincidence, surely. We have many guests. That's when she saw the tag. It was a small, rectangular piece of brass, just as tarnished as the key itself. Graved on its surface an elegant Lupin script was her name. Not just her first name, her full name, Clara Ann Fowler. The lobby was quiet, steeped in the scent of beeswax and old paper. A room for the night, Clara said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous space. The clerk nodded slowly, his movements deliberate, as he turned to a wall of shadowed alcoves. Clara reached for it, her fingers brushing against the cold metal. This has my name on it, she stammered, holding it up. A cold shock went through her, sharp and electric. The clerk blinked, his expression unchanging. But my full name, Clara Ann Fowler. T, that's not a common name. The name has been on that tag for 50 years, the clerk said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. It's too weary to argue, and with the storm raging outside, Clara let it go. She told herself he was right. She was tired, seeing things. The hallway on the 3rd floor was a long, narrow throat of peeling floral wallpaper and threadbare carpet. The room inside was spacious and meticulously clean, but frozen in time. There were 5 of them, all in identical, ornate, dark wood frames. Clara moved closer, a creeping dread icing her veins. Her breath hitched. This was no coincidence. This was a nightmare. Then Clara saw it. It was empty. The frame was identical to the others, surrounding a rectangle of dark, faded wallpaper where a portrait should have been. It was waiting. The plaque was polished, unlike the others. It gleamed in the dim light, and engraved upon its surface were 2 lines of text. Clara Ann Fowler, October 24th, 2024, tomorrow's date. A scream tore from her throat as she spun around and lunged for the door. Help! The only answer was the oppressive, suffocating silence of the inn. She looked at the portraits at the gallery of the damned who had held this key before her, and then, through her terror, she noticed one final detail. On the small writing desk in the corner, where there had been nothing before, now sat a single, pristine artist's brush, its bristles stark white. Next to it was a small porcelain pot, open and waiting. It was filled to the brim with the blackest paint she had ever seen. The room was no longer silent. From somewhere deep within the walls, she could hear the faint, rhythmic sound of a clock, ticking steadily, counting down the final hours to sunrise. And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.